And we've heard this conversation recently about undoing the consumer welfare standard. Can you talk a bit about what that standard is and why it's so important in anchoring antitrust to focus on the right things rather than the wrong things?
Sure. So the consumer welfare standard is, I think there's sort of this idea sometimes that the consumer welfare standard is like some piece of language that somebody somewhere out there. What it really is a set of tools and presumptions that antitrust law has developed over several decades that say basically we're going to measure competitive good competition versus bad competition by its outcome for consumers. And you can see why this is really important because in both cases, when you have like good, justifiable competition, when you have two competitors who are going head to head and trying to win consumers, when one of them wins, the other one loses. And so there is a harm to competitors in good competition. And there's also a harm to competitors when a competitor is doing something bad. And so we want to think about like, how do we know good competition from bad competition? And the consensus has been in recent times that we're going to measure by the outcome for consumers. Now, that's a challenging problem in many cases. It can be difficult to measure, but it's certainly easier to measure something like, is this good or bad for consumers than it is to measure something like, which company has more political power, right? Or how are we going to trade off, picking winners and losers? So it's more objective in that sense. It avoids this sort of balancing. The consumer welfare standard sort of avoids this balancing of different interests. So if I'm trying to say, well, I care about consumer welfare, but also care about political power, and I also care about the size of competitors, what that means is if I go before a judge as a company, I have no idea which of those dimensions to argue on, and I have no idea. They can pick whatever decision they want, and they can probably find some evidence that meets one of those dimensions, and there's no principled way to balance between those different dimensions. And so what it means is we have a law that is much more subjective, that's much more arbitrary, and the consumer welfare standard gives us a single dimension to argue on, and it focuses on the ultimate outcome. It also helps align industry practices towards those that are the most economically efficient. And so I think the reason that people want to change this standard is that it gets in the way of them using antitrust law for purposes that they hope to achieve that are different than economic purposes, frankly. And so the question is, why are they choosing to do that through antitrust law rather than other types of policy? And I think it's because antitrust is a big, attractive, powerful tool, but misusing that tool doesn't make a ton of sense to me. And so I do think the consumer welfare standard has done a really good job of focusing us on what at least the right approach. That's not to say the law is static. It's not. There's lots of debates in the antitrust bar about how do you measure consumer welfare? How might you consider different factors as affecting consumer welfare? There's lots of debates over the economics and the evidence. And that's appropriate, but at least we're all arguing about the same set of principles, the same goal. We all share the same goal, and that's been to the benefit of antitrust law.
I think the other point here, so much of what we've talked about so far has basically been policy reasons why using antitrust is the wrong answer. The other big point to make sure we don't miss here is that the First Amendment also speaks a lot to this, or very well may speak to a lot of this. While we're talking about the policy issues, the First Amendment restrains the government. It doesn't restrain Facebook. And the attempts to, by some litigators to try to apply the First Amendment to social media platforms have failed, and correctly so. So if at least depending upon the contours of exactly what is proposed, and whatever it means to break up tech companies for this purpose, even where the law or the approach is not directly content discriminatory, if the purpose behind it is to impose content policies on these platforms that would regulate their expression, they are private companies.